Welcome to another exciting, thrilling Persiflager's podcast, a review of the infectious disease literature with snarky commentary for the first 2 weeks of August 2007. Don't forget, if you're listening to this on an iPod, you can skip ahead to the next chapter, but why would you want to? This is brought to you by Puscast LLC, publisher of the Persiflager's Annotated Compendium of Infectious Disease Facts, Dogma, and Opinion, your uber-hyperlinked electronic guide to infectious diseases, available at Puscast.com. The opinions of those in this podcast are those of Puscast LLC and of no one else. So if you don't like what you hear, blame me. It is, however, CME accredited. Take the online quiz after you listen and get a half an hour of free Type 1 CME thanks to the Legacy Health System. Because it's CME accredited, I have to mention potential conflicts of interests. I have none. I'm not interested in conflicts, nor do I have any conflicts of interest. This podcast is a review of the infectious disease literature aimed primarily at clinicians and other healthcare professionals and the occasional psychotic amateur. A couple things. If you like it, go to iTunes and write me a good review on iTunes. If you like this, check out my other podcast, The Quackcast, a review of complementary and alternative medicine, i.e. scams, which if you like also, go write me a review on iTunes. The references are available online at Puscast.com. And now, for those of you who are waiting breathlessly for the literature, we will move on to the literature. As summer ends, we head into the flu season, so we'll start with flu this month. Don't forget to get your vaccine when it's available. But be that as it may, the first article concerns the transmission of avian influenza. This was mostly a statistical study that looked at the transmission in both Turkey and Indonesia to try to determine what the chances are that the disease is spread human to human. They estimated that in Sumatra, the secondary infection rate due to avian influenza was almost 30%, whereas they did not find evidence for human-to-human transmission in Turkey. Why might that be? Well, there are different human populations in those two countries, and the virus has mutated as it's spread across the world. We still wait for avian influenza to jump from a routine human-to-human spread, but at least for the time being, the upper limit of transmissibility in humans, which is primarily within families, would be about 30%, which is pretty impressive. As the avian influenza spreads across the world, it does undergo mutations and genetic drift that leads to resistance to antibiotics. Part of the proof of this is they looked at different clades of influenza virus, specifically the H5N1, the bird flu, and found that depending on where you are, there's increasing resistance to the drug we hope to use against avian influenza, oseltamivir. They found that the Cambodian strains were 6-fold less sensitive to oseltamivir, and the Indonesian clades were 30-fold less sensitive to oseltamivir. So as time goes on, the avian influenza is becoming less susceptible to one of the two drugs that we have for the treatment of this virus. We still have susceptibility to zanamivir, but given that zanamivir is an inhaled agent, it will probably not do diddly come the bird flu pandemic. So one can anticipate that when it does jump to humans, it will not be able to be stopped with the current available anti-influenza, antiviral agents. Yippee skippy. So what are people going to do come the pandemic when they can't get drugs and we don't have enough vaccine? Well, a recent study looked at this, and they sent surveys to people and asked what you're going to do when the pandemic comes down. Well, 60% said that they would only shop for essentials, and 50% said they wouldn't go to work or let their children go to school. A significant percentage said that they would not go to public places, and about a third said they wouldn't go see their doctor, which may or may not be wise. The depressing thing about this is that includes healthcare professionals who about half say will not come to work should the pandemic hit. So when you're going to get sick, you're going to get sick and die alone. But in the end, don't we all? However, for those who survive, taking these precautionary effects will be of great benefit. This was published in the JAMA I thought it was a fascinating historical study where they looked back at the 1918-1919 pandemic, and they looked at a 24-week period to see how public health interventions affected the death rates. Now, during this 24-week period, there were 115,000 deaths due to influenza, about 500 per 100,000 population, which is pretty impressive. And this was just in 43 cities that they looked at during this 24 weeks. They did find, however, that taking public health measures did decrease the overall mortality in the cities that applied them. What were these behavioral modifications? Well, they closed schools and they banned public gatherings. And those were statistically significant in preventing the number of deaths and the onset of the maximal number of deaths in the city that immediately applied those public health measures. So if the pandemic hits, the sooner your city closes schools, stops public gathering, and isolates and quarantines the people who have avian influenza, or it might be regular influenza, the fewer deaths that you will see in your community, and maybe you won't die as a result. So I know you don't really want to die of bird flu. What other animal-related illnesses can you die from? Well, how about hantavirus pulmonary syndrome? How risky is it if you're a field biologist working with small mammals to acquire hantavirus pulmonary syndrome from your work? Well, this article in the journal Emerging Infections did some studies that estimated the overall probability is, they say, low, and appears to be about 1 in 1,400. Well, how do you put this in perspective? Well, your lifetime risk of dying in a car accident is about 1 in 78. Your chance of dying from a gunshot wound is about lifetime 1 in 314. And your chance of dying from a medical complication, my bread and butter, is 1 in 1,300. So it would appear that your risk of acquiring hantavirus from professionally handling rodents is a little less than your chance of being killed by your physician when you're in the hospital. That's lifetime risk, not yearly risk. It's nice to know, with a lifetime risk of dying in a car accident being about 1 in 6,000 and your risk of dying from your doctor was 1 in 1,300, that it's safer to be in the hospital than it is to drive your car. Now, if we could just put seatbelts and airbags on our patients' beds, we'd be all set. Okay, I don't want to die of avian flu, so I'm going to stay home. And I don't want to die of hantavirus, so I'm just going to sit in my backyard and stay away from rodents. Hey, look at all the mosquitoes this year. Why should you care about mosquitoes? Well, they spread dengue. And dengue is spreading north. And an article in the MMWR has investigated dengue in Texas in about 2005. It's spreading in the border states of Mexico that border Texas, hence they're called border states. And they found on serologic testing that about a third of the people of Brownsville, Texas, are seropositive for dengue. They've been asymptomatic. But what happens when you're immune to dengue and then you get bit by a mosquito with another strain of dengue that causes dengue hemorrhagic fever, the brisk immune response that occurs will allow you to go on to develop the often fatal dengue hemorrhagic fever. So this is one of these diseases that's slowly creeping north with global warming, and places that I live, such as the Pacific Northwest, are in the future going to be prime candidates for the development of endemic dengue. So there's no end of the opportunities for you to die from some sort of unexpected virus. The Border Patrol may be able to stop the immigrants, but they're not going to be able to stop the mosquitoes. I've been working hard here to keep the general infectious disease terror level up, because it's, of course, good for me. But how about, West Nile virus that's been sweeping across the United States since the turn of the century? Well, the interesting thing about this is that it's estimated that maybe 2.5 million people have been exposed to West Nile, although only a small percentage actually get the encephalitis that accompanies the disease. Why this is important is that antibody directed against the flavivirus, which causes West Nile, is effective in the treatment of the disease in animal models. And so this study looked at the amount of West Nile virus neutralization that can be found in plasma products in the United States. And not unsurprisingly, the further east you went, the more likely you were to have high levels of neutralizing antibodies in your antibody preparations. And the further west you went, because we've had less disease out here, the less West Nile virus you are going to see in your pooled antibody. So if you're in New Jersey and you come down with West Nile, you may or may not get benefit from pooled immunoglobulins, where if you're here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, where I live, we still haven't seen much in the way of West Nile, and it's unlikely that local pooled immunoglobulin will be of much benefit in the treatment of West Nile. There are clinical trials looking at high titer antibody against West Nile in the treatment of the disease. I do not know the results of those trials to date. One would predict they would be beneficial, however, to receive pooled antibody or high titered antibody against West Nile virus should one come down with that particular illness. The Parvoviridae. The most well-known one is parvovirus B19, which is the one that affects red cells and causes fifth disease. There's a little-known Parvo B52, which infects rock lobsters. I'll pause here while you laugh hysterically at that cultural reference. But there are other Parvoviridae as well. There's the Parvo V4, they call it PARV4, which is a parvovirus that apparently causes a nonspecific viral syndrome and is spread primarily by parenteral route. And it's seen primarily in injection drug users and in hemophiliacs. So people who get nonspecific viral syndromes after being exposed to blood products may have parvovirus V4. There's also a parvovirus V5, and it's more distantly related to the parvovirus B16 that we all know and love. It would appear, at least on genetic typing, to be closely related to a chipmunk parvovirus. But as we get our genetic technology down, we discover more and more viruses that cause often mostly asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic diseases in people. If you're listening to this on an iPod, you probably live in the West and you probably have reasonably good health and nutrition. This is not the case, of course, for most of the world, where one of the number one causes of death worldwide is diarrhea. Now, rotavirus gastroenteritis is estimated to kill 500,000 children ages 5 or under every year and probably account for 2 million hospitalizations for children a year. 500,000 people is a lot of death. Well, there's something that can be done about it. In Journal Pediatrics, they published an article that showed that a live attenuated human rotavirus vaccine given 2 doses was extremely effective in preventing rotavirus infection in children. 80 to 95% of rotavirus infections were prevented with this vaccine. This has the potential to save millions of lives, and it's one of those great advances in technology. Unfortunately, most of the countries that need this probably can't afford it. And sad to say, there are still people out there who think that vaccines are evil rather than one of the greatest boons to humankind ever. But just so you know, there are now 500,000 preventable childhood deaths every year, so that in places like Africa, they can grow up to die of tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, war, and malnutrition instead. This podcast doesn't seem to have a lot of laughs this week. I wonder what's wrong with my attitude. There was a report in Medscape from the International Society for Sexually Transmitted Disease Research. I'm sure that's a meeting where the prostitutes don't get a lot of business. But anyway, this was a study that looked at syphilis and HIV patients, and they followed 231 patients, of whom 41 had neurosyphilis. And the interesting thing about this cohort when studied is that they acquired reinfection or disease very rapidly, usually within 4 to 6 weeks or at least a year after being treated for their initial syphilis. The problem with syphilis is that being a sexually transmitted disease, people tend to participate in the behavior that leads to acquisition with some degree of frequency. And as such, patients who got syphilis once were much more likely to go on to develop syphilis or even tertiary syphilis much more rapidly than non-AIDS patients. So a patient who has syphilis, think about reinfection or relapse if they have any symptoms in the first year or two, and goes to the heart of the matter that sexually active men who have sex with men should probably be getting their syphilis test at least twice a year. There have been multiple studies out now to show that circumcision is beneficial in preventing the spread of HIV in heterosexual contact. Is that the same with homosexual men? Unfortunately, no. And in a study at the same meeting as the last report, they looked at 1,400 homosexual men over time and found that the presence of circumcision did not prevent the spread of HIV, which is a bummer. Probably because people get HIV under these circumstances from having receptive anal intercourse rather than insertive intercourse, which is what protects men with heterosexual transmission of HIV. So if you're trying to decide if you should have your male child circumcised, if he's gay, probably won't make any difference, and if he's not, it may be a benefit in preventing sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. As long as we're on the subject of transmission of HIV, one of the issues currently is that drug-resistant organisms are increasingly being transmitted. Now, the nice thing, and I use nice sarcastically, about HIV is that over time, resistant strains slowly revert to susceptible strains. Now, this study, which was published in Clinics of Infectious Diseases, looked at drug resistance to NNRTI group and found that it took greater than 3 years for the blood isolate to revert to wild type in the few patients studied. But even when the blood organism reverted to wild type, the isolates from the male genital tract remained resistant, so that even though it was susceptible in the blood, it was resistant in the secretions, and these were then subsequently transmitted to others. So just because a patient has a susceptible type in their blood, if they had had a resistant HIV in the past in the blood, they may still have it in the genital tract, ready for the transmission to others. The number of rickettsia that can cause human illnesses continues to multiply. I just mentioned this because a case report from northern Spain yielded a new rickettsia monacensis, which causes a spotted fever illness in, i.e., northern Spain. Fevers, headache, rash, non-focal, cytopenias, that's a tetracycline deficiency state that may be due to a rickettsia. And there are many rickettsia out there, depending on their travel history, that could be infecting your patients. So bear in mind the clinical syndrome of what we ID doctors like to refer to as a doxycycline deficiency state. Because I'm an internist, I don't deal with childhood diseases as a rule, but I found an interesting article in Clinical Infectious Diseases that looked at rheumatic fever in Hawaii. Now, what's interesting about rheumatic fever in Hawaii is, one, is that they still have it. Rheumatic fever in the continental United States is still uncommon. The other interesting thing is it was appearing primarily in Samoan and other Polynesian populations. And the third interesting thing is they looked at the group A strep that was associated with rheumatic fever in this population and found it was due to types that usually are not associated with rheumatic fever in the continental United States. Now, whether this is due to changes in the group A strep or the susceptible population is uncertain. But the interesting thing is that in Hawaii, at least, rheumatic fever is due to strains that usually don't cause rheumatic fever in non-Polynesian groups. And, I forgot to mention, they're more likely to have skin and soft tissue infections rather than acute strep throat. Interesting, huh? I've talked in other podcasts about environmental conditions that lead to the outbreak of Legionella, my favorite being that if you have hot, muggy weather and thunderstorms, that in the 7 to 10 days that follow, you can see a spike in Legionella. Well, there was a nice outbreak, not so nice for the people who got it, in South Dakota, where there was a restaurant that had a decorative fountain, and this decorative fountain had Legionella pneumophila in it, and it gave Legionella to 6 of 11 patients who developed the disease who had eaten at this restaurant. They don't specify which restaurant it is. Local water supplies and fountains, especially if they're not chlorinated, can be a source of legionellosis. Sometimes I walk through the hospitals and I see little decorative water fountains, and I always get them removed and be irritable about it. There's also another report of a cluster in military people and they're not certain of the environmental source. But look for local fountains if you're starting to see a Legionella, and ask patients carefully about exposure to any sorts of water. Part of the fun in infectious diseases is figuring out where people get their infections. There is a nice case in emerging infectious diseases of someone who got endocarditis from using a tongue scraper. Evidently, people use a tongue scraper in an attempt to control their bad breath. This lady had underlying mitral valve disease, and shortly after using a tongue scraper for her bad breath, she developed endocarditis due to Haemophilus parainfluenza. I was unaware that people used tongue scrapers, and now when I see my patients with a variety of oral endocarditides, I will ask them if they use tongue scrapers. I'm so out of touch in so many other areas it boggles the mind. There's a brief report in Clinical Infectious Diseases of someone who had a bikini wax, which to remove all their pubic hair, and as a result got toxic shock syndrome and group A strep. Then the person tried to shave the pubic hair at a later date and also got group A strep infections as a result. Evidently, there's a wide variety of ways to remove pubic hair that are popular in the youngsters these days. Back in the day, we kept all our pubic hair. But as a consequence, this person got a very severe infection. She was an underlying diabetic, but yet another source of potential infections in people. To further solidify my reputation as an out-of-touch old fogey, they go into great details on how pubic hair is removed and pubic hair removal through history. There's so much out there that I don't know. For example, did you know that pigs can get an exudative epidermitis, and this is due to Staph aureus, specifically methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, and can spread it to humans? Yes, it's true. There's the case report to prove it. So, don't have contact with your pigs with boils. I think that's good advice. On a more practical note, you're probably aware of the Panton-Valentine leukocidin, a Staph aureus toxin that lyses white cells and other cells, and when associated with pneumonia is a deadly illness. It causes, in this case, a necrotizing pneumonia with a mortality rate that approaches 60%. What do you look for in patients who have pneumonia with a Panton-Valentine producing Staph aureus? Well, there are a couple things: airway bleeding, erythroderma, and leukopenia. These three things are highly associated with the presence of a necrotizing pneumonia due to Panton-Valentine leukocidin. What to do about it is problematic. It's often MRSAs, and in my neck of the woods, clindamycin usually has no efficacy against our Staph aureus. I think it would probably be a benefit to give patients some antibiotic that messed with protein synthesis, so you could mess with the production of the Panton-Valentine leukocidin. Whether that would make any difference by the time you figure out that the patient has a necrotizing pneumonia due to Staph aureus. But watch for leukopenia, airway bleeding, and erythroderma in your patients with staph pneumonias. I've seen a couple, and they've died, and it's not a pleasant death, as if there is a pleasant death. A common clinical conundrum. Patient comes in, and you think they have a serious staph infection. If you live in a community such as I do with lots of MRSA, you initially start the patient on vancomycin, substituting nafcillin once the patient is identified as having a methicillin-susceptible organism. Now, the one time I don't do this is patients who I think have staph meningitis. I put them on vancomycin and nafcillin pending cultures because vancomycin is such a crappy antibiotic. Now, there was an interesting article that was published in Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy that looked at patients who were IV drug users who came in with endocarditis. Those who received vancomycin up front, and even if they were switched to a beta-lactam, did worse than patients who were on a beta-lactam up front. So from this study, which is small in number, it would suggest that if you had a patient coming in with staph endocarditis, it would be better to have them on nafcillin and vancomycin pending the results of your cultures, and then stopping one or the other rather than switching. If you listen now very carefully, you will hear the moans and groans of pharmacists in severe pain. This may come as a surprise to you, but being an IV drug user is not a healthy lifestyle. Part of this is shown in a study that looked at staph carriage rates, and IV drug users and looked to see whether or not they were HIV positive or not. Not unsurprisingly, being an IV drug user was associated with carrying Staph aureus in your nose. But if you were also HIV positive, you had twice the risk of carrying Staph aureus in your nose. And the colonization, unlike normal people, was persisting in the same strain, lasting up to a year in these patients. So, not unsurprisingly, if you have HIV and you're an IV drug user, you're going to be colonized with staph, and subsequently you're likely to get a staph infection. I strongly recommend that if you're using IV drugs that you stop. What a hard call, huh? Mortality for C. difficile diarrhea has been increasing at 35% per year in the United States, which is fairly impressive. There were an estimated 20,000 deaths due to C. difficile between 1999 and 2000. This is in contrast to 3,000 deaths due to other infectious diarrheas. So C. difficile is having a major impact on mortality rates in the United States, with 8 times the death rates compared to all other infectious diarrheas combined. That's pretty impressive, and in part due to the fact that the organism is becoming more virulent, and there are strains of this disease, as discussed in other podcasts, that produce large amounts of toxin. The never-ending debate, however, is what's the best treatment for C. difficile diarrhea. Well, this study, published in Clinical Infectious Disease, randomized patients with C. difficile diarrhea to receive either Flagyl or vancomycin, and were stratified whether they had mild disease or severe disease. They had a point system that determined severity of disease, and they were given points for age, temperature, albumin, white count greater than 15,000, and whether or not they needed to go to the ICU. And if they had a certain number of points, they were declared to be severe disease. Now, the interesting thing is that if you had mild disease, metronidazole and vancomycin were the same in treating the illness. However, if you had severe disease, vancomycin was a superior agent. The vancomycin group in severe disease had a 97% success rate, where there was a 76% success rate if they were treated with metronidazole. So it would appear in this particular study that if you have severe C. difficile diarrhea, the treatment of choice may well be vancomycin. Now we'll drive VRE resistance, which will in turn jump those genes to Staph aureus, and soon we'll have vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus. I think the other take-home message is if you have a patient with mild C. difficile, stick with metronidazole. It is as effective as vancomycin, and reserve the use of vancomycin for more severe illnesses. So you have traveler's diarrhea, or your patient has traveler's diarrhea. Well, what do you treat them with and for how long? This study was published in the Clinical Infectious Diseases and looked at patients in Turkey. The majority of them had either E. coli or Campylobacter as the cause of their diarrhea, and they were randomized to receive either a gram of azithromycin or half a gram of levofloxacin plus antidiarrheals, and they found that the two were of comparable efficacy in the treatment of diarrhea. The patients with the levofloxacin group did get better a little faster. They had diarrhea for 3 hours after starting the medication, whereas the azithromycin group had diarrhea for 13 hours. I can't see that that's a significant difference. These were all non-inflammatory diarrheas, by the way, i.e. they were not bloody. So if you get the Hershey squirts after traveling, consider a single dose of azithromycin or a single dose of levofloxacin. They are of equal efficacy. Now, you know and I know that all bacteria are not the same, and some strains have different pathogenicities compared to other strains. This is true of Klebsiella pneumoniae. There are several strains out there that cause a variety of illnesses. The interesting one is liver abscesses due to Kleb pneumo, and this appears to be due to a strain that makes specific genes, the MAG-A and the RMPA genes, that make the organism have, I love this term, hypermucoviscosity phenotype. They're very sticky. And this is the type of Kleb pneumoniae that's associated with the development of liver abscesses. This strain, called the K1 strain, is overrepresented in liver abscesses and is particularly resistant to phagocytosis and This strain also has a predilection for causing ocular and central nervous system complications. So be on the lookout for this particular strain of Klebsiella in your neighborhood. I'm at 29 minutes and still have a ways to go. This is a new version of GarageBand, so we'll see if it crashes at the 45-minute limit like it used to. Of interest, the reason people get infections is because they're mutants. And this was an interesting study that looked at asymptomatic bacteria in children and found that children who had asymptomatic bacteria had a decrease in their expression of the toll-like receptor number 4. I've talked in other podcasts how alterations in the toll-like receptors can lead to different infection predilection in patients, and this one found that in children. I don't know yet what the significance this is in adults, but it's interesting that yet another study shows that mutations in the toll-like receptor, in this case a downregulation, leads to an increased rates of asymptomatic bacteria in children. This is a developing area that we're only going to know more and more about as time goes by. So, as I've said before, do not ask for whom the receptor tolls. It tolls for thee. A couple of podcasts ago, I talked about how vitamin D used to be used as a treatment for tuberculosis and how vitamin D deficiency states may make patients more susceptible to tuberculosis. Well, how does this work? Well, there's an article in the Journal of Immunology that looked at vitamin D and tuberculosis in the test tube. Vitamin D induces cathelicidins. Cathelicidins are antibacterial proteins found in cells. And so one of the ways that vitamin D may work in killing tuberculosis is by inducing cathelicidins in macrophages and subsequently allowing the death of Mycobacterium tuberculosis. When they knocked out the ability to make cathelicidins due to vitamin D, they were unable to kill off Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So this suggests that the way vitamin D works in tuberculosis is to induce cathelicidins, which subsequently kill the intracellular Mycobacterium tuberculosis. I just think this is so cool. So Mycobacterium avium infections are increasing in the West compared to other countries. Why do we get MAI in this country? Well, it may be the fact that MAI is found in the water. And in places that have cultured water supply, you can find MAI in as much as half of tap water. It grows in the faucet. And it grows in the shower heads. And there was an interesting article in Clinical Infectious Diseases that demonstrated that the types that were found in the shower heads were the same ones that were found in patients, so that the MAI was being acquired from the bathroom and the shower. They postulate that in the West, showers are the preferred mechanism of cleanliness, and as a result, we are more likely to aerosolize and inhale MAC isolates. So I think the key message here is stop taking showers. Culturing the environment is always problematic in the clinical setting, but if you had a patient who is profoundly immunocompetent, such as an AIDS patient, you might want to recommend that showers may not, and I emphasize the word may here, be the optimal way to participate in personal hygiene. What's the best drug to use against Candida infections, especially disseminated Candida infections? I'm tending now towards the echinocandidin class of antibiotics, i.e. drugs like caspofungin, in part because that there's a slight suggestion of superiority of these agents in the studies, although technically they show equivalency or non-inferiority. Now, one of the interesting things about Candida species is they do make biofilms, and that a recent study correlated the production of biofilms by Candida with outcome, i.e. those that made biofilms were more likely to kill the patient. There's some interesting data that I've seen in the past that suggests that echinocandidins are particularly good at killing Candida species that are associated with biofilms. So this may be in part why you get a better outcome, perhaps, with the echinocandidin class of antibiotics in treating disseminated Candida infections. I just wish they didn't cost $300 a dose compared to $1 for fluconazole. I'll always give the best therapy, but man, I wish the price gouging on these drugs wasn't quite so bad. I just mentioned this in passing, but the galactomannan assay for Aspergillus had cross-reaction with other fungal species that were not Aspergillus, specifically blastomycoses, nigrospora, Pasteomyces, Penicillium, and Trichothecium. So it's not specific to Aspergillus, although these are very unusual pathogens with the exception of Blastomyces dermatitidis. But bear in mind that a positive galactomannan assay, while almost certainly going to be due to invasive Aspergillus, could potentially be cross-reacting with other fungi, especially blastomycoses. A dog with asymptomatic diarrhea passed on Cryptosporidium to a pair of children. So this is another potential source of cryptosporidiosis, your local dog. Now this was in Peru, but I assume it could happen in the United States as well. So when you bring that damn dog in for pet therapy that's asymptomatic for its diarrhea and licking its butt and then licking itself and you let your patient touch it, don't forget your patient may come down with cryptosporidiosis as a result. God, I hate dogs. In my hospital. They belong in the countryside, not in my patient room. Finally, do you know what drug reps cost you personally if you see them? Probably $6,000 a year. This study was in medical economics, and they estimated that if you see drug reps for an hour a week and you billed for CPT code 213 for an intermediate visit, you would clear $12,000 over a 50-week period by seeing a patient during that time instead of a drug rep. They say, well, you got to subtract 50% for your overhead, so that would be $6,000 a year, which is what one physician saw his income go up after stopping to see drug reps. So you may or may not know it, but if you're going to see a drug rep, you should probably charge them for a visit because they are costing you money, both directly in not seeing patients and indirectly by your overhead. And so that's it, the end of another exciting infectious disease podcast. Review the literature with snarky commentary. This one is covering the first 2 weeks of August 2007. This is CME accredited. Listen now. Go take the online quiz. Get a half an hour of free CME. Thank you, Legacy Health Systems. This is brought to you by Pusware LLC, the publisher of the Persiflager's Annotated Compendium of Infectious Disease Facts, Dogma, and Opinion. Available online at Pusware.com. If you like this sort of nonsense, check out my Quackcast at quackcast.com, a snarky review of alternative medicine, i.e. bullshit. Bandwidth ain't free, so feel free to purchase the compendium and support the podcast. This is copyright by the Creative Commons license, www.creativecommons.org. The music is my 12-year-old son improvising on the guitar. Feel free to email me with comments at mcrislip@pusware.com. And as always, thank you for this most interesting consultation, allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I will continue to follow along with you. Thank you. In dictation, goodbye. Wait, what do you mean I haven't done proper PAR? God damn it.